Now to give the final substantive speech of today's debate and to conclude her team's substantive case, Aria.
Ladies and gentlemen, what side proposition has come up and told you today is that people who were not responsible for wrongs committed in the past, who have not benefited and who may be disadvantaged themselves, must pay for wrongs that are committed in the past to people who aren't even necessarily disadvantaged. They've told us they're quite happy to give very rich black people or very rich Aborigines lots of money because of these historical wrongs. They said they don't care about their level in society currently. And that is absolutely wrong. And that's not the kind of way that we accept welfare distribution to operate. So I have 3 points for you today. First of all, I'm going to tell you why it's morally unjustified to make current generations pay for these past wrongs. Secondly, I'm going to explain why this is not the best way to solve inequality between groups in society. And finally, I'm going to explain how this actively harms the kind of groups that they want to help. So let's address this first idea of whether or not it's been morally justified to make current generations pay. And by the time they'd gotten to third proposition, this is what their entire case had become about. It was no longer about the practical implications or benefits that they brought up at first about helping people. They wanted to tell you it doesn't matter if they're poor now, it's actually really just about whether or not we were bad to them in the past. And we say, look, it's really horrific that we did these things in the past, but it's not right to make the current government pay. So why is that? Now, we've told you, in response to the point about the state being a continuous entity, that in fact, states vary very much over time. They have different policies, they have different ways of operating, and aren't continuous in this way. But furthermore, the state is simply the representation of the people. And we say that the kind of people that are the state now are not people that had any hand in what went on in the past. They're not people who had a choice about whether or not we went and raped and pillaged all of these villages. So it's not good enough to make them suffer just because their ancestors did something that they had no idea about. That's unjust. No thank you. And then finally, we told you also that only those who commit a crime should be punished. And Nick offered you several examples of this. We say that when you commit a crime, you alone are responsible for that, and you should take on the ramifications of this. We furthermore told you that the wrong people pay under their proposal. We told you there are 3 groups who pay for this. First of all, the descendants of those who committed the crime, and I've just explained why we can't allow them to pay. But secondly, immigrants to that country pay who have had even less of a hand and absolutely no benefit. If they want to talk about white people benefiting from their ancestors owning slaves, first of all, we don't think that's true. But secondly, they've completely ignored a very important stakeholder in this group, which is immigrants who have come to that country who haven't had any hand in it and haven't had any kind of benefits. Finally, we told you the descendants of these oppressed groups themselves pay for it. And if they can't see why that's wrong, then we really don't understand the principle. Yes, sir.
But what about the immigrants to tobacco companies, the new shareholders that have to pay for past injustice? Something your second speaker said she was
Well, so this is very different, in fact. Companies are quite different because they break the law in a lot of what they do. They're very different to governance. They're very different to governance in the way that they respond to things. We say company boards make decisions and shareholders accept to be liable for those decisions. We say that the state doesn't do this because the current people weren't accepting that liability. Finally, they told us that actually the nature of tax is that we just pay for things that we don't do and that we don't have any standard. And we say, no, this is a mischaracterization of welfare in general. What we do in society is we take taxes from those who are advantaged. More taxes, yes. Rich people do pay more taxes. Thank you for pointing that out. But then we give them to people who have the most need. And we say that's the only fair and justified way to distribute wealth within society. Finally, they told us that this would act as some kind of deterrent or disincentive to committing future atrocities. Now, this is entirely ridiculous. We say that when people in the past were committing these atrocities, they certainly weren't thinking, oh God, are my grandchildren going to have to pay for what I'm doing right now? So we don't see any logical reason why current generations are going to do that either. This deterrent point was ridiculous, and that became clear when they dropped it at third. So let's move on to how this is in fact a really bad way to solve inequality with groups in society. We told you that welfare and basing aid on need is the best way to do this. Because in fact, that way you help all the people who may or may not have been disadvantaged because of past wrongs. You encapsulate those people in our model. You give them the kind of aid that they need. But what you don't get is the kind of unnecessary wastage where you're handing money out to very wealthy people who come under a certain ethnic group. What you don't allow is abuse of the system that occurs with things that they wanted to talk about at first, like preferential access to jobs, preferential access to universities, and scholarships and the like. You don't see very wealthy people under our system taking those kinds of benefits where they don't need them, where that money and resources could be better placed with a poor immigrant person, or a poor white person for that matter, who needs this far more than that person who has a historical disadvantage. Yes, sir.
But isn't it true that there are maybe rich black people, but 24.5% of black people
thanks for that. I've just explained that our model perfectly well encapsulates people who are poor. We're telling you we're going to give them aid. We're not happy to give the very rich black people aid. Thank you for that useless point of information. So, they didn't address that this is an ineffective mechanism. They didn't address our perfect example of Zimbabwe, where in fact you just gave them that land and made black people poorer because you didn't give them the kind of mechanisms they needed to manage that new compensation. Then they told us that we told you that because we can't pay everyone, we need to pay those who need it the most. And that was what they wanted to talk about at first in terms of practicalities, yet this was lost by their third speaker. Finally, we told you that this actively harms minority groups. We told you that this breeds resentment to these groups, that leads to the active discrimination of such groups within society. This in fact perpetuates wrongs against these groups, and we think that's unacceptable. So let's look at their responses to this. First of all, they told us that actually they don't support affirmative action. They changed their model, and they told us, look, no, that's not going to happen because we're not doing affirmative action. Completely do not understand that response, because that is exactly what they're proposing. Secondly, they told us they don't care if there's resentment. We say that's not good enough because that resentment translates to tangible harms and tangible discrimination within society, for example, the workforce or education. Finally, they told us resentment isn't solved because poor people get resented under our model. We tell you that this is untrue because often, these people have need for that aid. Other people recognise that this is a much fairer distribution of the wealth. Finally, we told you that this disincentivises other kinds of help, like cultural rejuvenation programs. The problem with a payout is you hand somebody money and you think that that's enough. You don't go towards cultural healing things. You don't have things like language rejuvenation programs in school. You don't have cultural objectives, which are often the most important ways that these groups have been oppressed over time. They told us that they're still going to get this under their model, but they refuse to engage with the idea that when you offer one form of compensation in a monetary way, often the government feels that they have done enough. So we say that's not good enough. So we told you that it is not good enough for side proposition to stand up today, take money off people who have done nothing wrong, and give it to people who are already very advantaged. Furthermore, we've told you the best way to help disadvantaged groups is through a welfare system based on need. We are most proud to oppose.